Well, outside of the D-Day landing commemorations, I think his priority will be to make sure that the government here is committed, after the UK leaves the European Union, to a free trade agreement with Australia. And he'll want to make sure that the British government understands that Australia wants a high-quality free trade agreement, not just a symbolic one. And I mean, he will get a good reception. The British government will tell him that that's their hope and expectation. So that'll be his first priority. I don't doubt he'll also have discussions with Theresa May and other British officials about broader international security issues, not least the question of Huawei and the extent to which the UK might decide to include Huawei in their 5G technology, which is something Australia wouldn't want to see happen. So the Australian government will certainly be trying to talk the British government out of using Huawei and 5G.
But just on Brexit, how easy or difficult is it for Scott Morrison to prosecute this case of post-Brexit free trade deal when Theresa May is only going to be PM for another week or so, maybe a little bit longer, and we don't know who's going to be taking on after her?
So there are 13 candidates now running for the leadership of the Conservative Party. They all say they're committed to Brexit in one way or another. So there are debates, though, about how it might happen. One possibility is that the UK may not leave the whole of the EU, but just leave its political structures, if you like, its decision-making structures, but remain in the economic structures. If they do that, then Australia won't be able to negotiate a free trade agreement with the UK. We'll just negotiate with the EU in Brussels. So I think most of the candidates, if not all, would rather the UK left the political and economic structures of the EU, but how to do it when you've got, it's quite easy to do, but when you've got a parliament very divided, an opposition which is just playing the opposition game, as well as the Scottish National Party, they just vote against everything. The government doesn't have an absolute majority, so it's vulnerable to a very small number of MPs on the government's own side dissenting from a government's position, which makes the whole thing incredibly unpredictable and difficult.
And what about the personalities? I mean, should Scott Morrison seek to meet with some of these people that could be Prime Minister when Theresa May goes?
Well, of the 13, I would say half of them wouldn't have any hope at all of becoming Prime Minister. The only ones who I think he would really need to focus on would be obviously Boris Johnson. I don't know if he knows Boris or not. He might spend a moment with Dominic Raab. He's a bit of a possibility, with Michael Gove, with Jeremy Hunt, the Foreign Secretary. You'll probably see him anyway. So beyond those four, I don't really think anyone else is going to cut through. Maybe Sajid Javid, the Home Secretary.
Would there be any gain for Morrison to try to meet with and form relationships, albeit brief, with anyone, particularly Boris Johnson?
Well, I think if he's got time, it's difficult to do because Donald Trump is here at the same time, and this is the 75th commemoration of the D-Day landings, so there are a lot of ceremonies associated with that. So to be blunt, he won't have a huge amount of time. If he has time, he should spend a little bit of it with maybe Boris Johnson, but Boris Johnson may not get it. He's just the front runner at the moment. Perhaps Michael Gove and Dominic Raab, I would say, those three in particular. And Jeremy Hunt, he automatically will spend time with because he's the Foreign Secretary. So, yeah, it would make sense for him to make contact with those people if he possibly can, because one of them is likely to be the next Prime Minister, so will be his counterpart. And I can tell you, in international diplomacy, personal relationships do count for quite a lot.
Here and back home, what kind of new authority does Scott Morrison have after winning an election that he said was a miracle?
He has a lot of authority. I mean, in the UK, there's a lot of interest in him because they have a Conservative government, and the Conservative Party here in the UK is, well, they're pretty impressed with the way he won. They're impressed with the sort of messages that he was able to push out to the Australian community, both negative and positive. And they're very interested in his broad agenda. I mean, you know, the very traditional agenda that Scott Morrison had for, in Australian terms, a Liberal government, and the UK terms, a Conservative government.
What do you mean by the negative messaging? People in the UK were impressed with the negative campaigns that Scott Morrison was running on tax?
There's no doubt about that. People are impressed with Scott Morrison's capacity to run a campaign against his political opponents. I mean, you know, the Labor Party created it, had a big target strategy. They thought their target was a glorious thing. And Scott Morrison went out there and attacked it day in and day out and demolished it. And I think here in the UK, people are pretty impressed with his skills in doing that. Oh, they'll be very interested to meet Scott Morrison.
You mentioned Donald Trump earlier. It's understood that Donald Trump likened Scott Morrison's victory with his own victory. Do you think that will help Scott Morrison when he tries to see and talk with Donald Trump this week?
Well, I think Donald Trump is always impressed with winners. There's no doubt about that. And Scott Morrison is a winner. And there is a sense that a lot of the commentariat had written off Scott Morrison. Or if they hadn't written him off, they were hoping he wouldn't win. So the fact that he turned it around and did win, I suppose Donald Trump thinks is a bit like his experience in 2016, which in some respects it is. Yeah, I think he would be pretty impressed. Why not? He would have obviously hoped the Liberals won, not the Labor Party, because the Labor Party in Australia has been going out there and slagging Donald Trump, which is okay. I mean, you know, it's a free world. You can say what you like about the President of the United States, but don't expect him to love you if you go around calling him a fascist or a weirdo or a madman.